At my husband's sister's engagement, the tag on my chest read, Housekeeper. His mother smirked, "You're just staff here. No chair, no plate, no place." My husband chuckled, "Food is for family." I stood tall, slid off my ring and said, "Then I'm no longer yours." His smile vanished, but that was only the beginning. Alexander didn't know I was home when he called his mother from our bedroom. "Mom's right, you need to learn your position," he said, and I froze outside the door holding the laundry basket. The housekeeper badge is perfect. Maybe after this, Victoria will stop pretending her little business matters. He laughed, actually laughed, about how his partners would enjoy seeing me taken down a notch at Zoe's engagement party. I set down the basket silently, walked to my home office and opened the folder I'd labeled Insurance. Inside were 6 months of documented evidence of Alexander's embezzlement from his firm. I'd hoped never to use it. Now I began drafting an anonymous SEC whistleblower report while my husband planned my humiliation in the next room. Before we continue, if you've ever been dismissed or undervalued by those who should have supported you, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us share these stories of resilience and justice. Now let's see how deep this betrayal goes. The laundry basket contained his Brooks Brothers shirts, each one pressed perfectly the way he demanded, with exactly 1 inch of starch in the collar. I'd been doing his laundry for 5 years, not because we couldn't afford help, but because Alexander insisted it showed proper wifely devotion. The same devotion that had me wake at 5:45 every morning to prepare his Colombian coffee while reviewing quarterly reports for failing businesses I was restructuring. He never knew that while he slept, I was saving Chicago restaurants from bankruptcy, negotiating with creditors and building financial models that would determine whether families kept their livelihoods. My home office had become a command center over the past 3 years. 2 monitors displayed spreadsheets for Romano's restaurant, which was hemorrhaging $30,000 monthly. Tony Romano had called me crying last week, saying his father would roll over in his grave if he knew the family business was failing. I'd already identified their problems. Food costs at 47% when they should be under 30%, 3 vendors overcharging them because nobody had renegotiated contracts in a decade, and a menu that hadn't adapted to neighborhood demographics that had shifted from Italian families to young professionals wanting quick lunch options. I'd fix it all for a fraction of what the big consulting firms charged, but according to Alexander, this was just my little hobby. The insurance folder felt heavier than its actual weight. 6 months ago, I'd noticed discrepancies in Alexander's home office files. He'd grown careless, leaving Lakeshore Capital documents on his desk, assuming I was too focused on my little business to understand complex financial instruments. But I understood them better than he did. Line items that didn't match. Portfolio company expenses that were actually personal charges. Investor funds diverted to accounts that traced back to Alexander's control. Classic embezzlement dressed up in private equity jargon. I'd photographed everything, created encrypted backups, and consulted quietly with Margaret Brennan, a former federal prosecutor who now handled corporate litigation. "This is criminal," she'd said simply. "When you're ready, this ends his career." I'd hoped that day would never come. Marriage meant protecting each other even from their own crimes. But apparently marriage to Alexander meant planning my public humiliation while I pressed his shirts. From the bedroom his voice carried clear. "The engagement party will be perfect. Zoe's marrying into serious money with Daniel, and it's time Victoria understood the difference between real success and playing businesswoman." Serafina's laugh tinkled through the phone speaker. They discussed details. How the name badge would be waiting at check-in, how there would be no chair at our table, how they'd make sure everyone noticed I wasn't being served food. "She saved your father's company," Serafina admitted, "but that doesn't make her family. Help is help no matter how well dressed." 18 months ago that help had worked 16-hour days to save Hawthorne Manufacturing from bankruptcy. Richard Hawthorne, Alexander's father, had built the company over 30 years, but COVID had exposed every weakness in their operations. Traditional consultants wanted $400,000 just to assess the situation. I restructured everything for $130,000, pivoting their production to ventilator components when the market demanded it, renegotiating union contracts without triggering strikes, and identifying inefficiencies that were costing them $200,000 monthly. I saved 200 jobs. Blue-collar workers with mortgages and kids in college kept their paychecks because I understood manufacturing logistics better than consultants who'd never set foot on a factory floor. Serafina had visited once during the restructuring, wrinkling her nose at the break room where I ate lunch with line supervisors. "These people," she'd said, not bothering to lower her voice. "This is so beneath the Hawthorne name." Yet the Hawthorne name only survived because I prevented bankruptcy. Thursday dinners at Serafina's Gold Coast mansion had become a masterclass in endurance. Every week at 7 p.m. sharp I arrived with homemade dessert, usually her favorite lemon tart that took 3 hours to perfect. She'd take one bite, declare it acceptable, then spend the meal dissecting my shortcomings. Victoria's keeping busy with her little consulting project, she'd tell her friends, emphasis on little and project, like I was a child with a lemonade stand. Meanwhile, Nexus Advisory had just crossed 7 figures in annual revenue. I built my company from our dining room table with $5,000 in savings and desperation that tasted metallic. 50 cold calls to failing restaurants. 49 rejections. 1 yes from Giuseppe's Pizzeria, and he only agreed because I offered the first consultation free. His daughter had rolled her eyes when I walked in. Young female, nothing like the gray-suited consultants they'd expected. But numbers don't lie. I reduced their costs by 35% without sacrificing quality, modernized their ordering system, and taught them social media marketing that brought in customers under 40 for the first time in years. Giuseppe told everyone. His cousin who owned a steakhouse. The Lebanese bakery across the street. The gastropub that was 3 weeks from closing. Within 6 months I had 8 clients. Within a year I hired James Fitzgerald from Deloitte because I couldn't handle the volume alone. Now I had 17 active restructuring projects and a waiting list of businesses willing to pay premium rates for resurrection. But to Alexander, success meant Lakeshore Capital, meant partner meetings in glass towers, meant other people's money-generating returns through financial engineering that created nothing real. My success, saving actual businesses, preserving actual jobs, was just my little project that kept me occupied while he did real business. I saved the draft of the SEC complaint and opened a new document. This one would be different. A timeline of every financial crime, every falsified document, every investor defrauded. Margaret Brennan would file it Monday morning if needed. The engagement party was Saturday. By then, Alexander would learn that some positions couldn't be taught through humiliation. Some positions were earned through competence, integrity, and the ability to destroy someone using their own crimes against them. His call ended with promises to his mother about how entertaining Saturday would be. I closed my laptop and returned to the laundry, folding his shirts with the same precision I applied to forensic accounting. Each crease perfect. Each collar exactly as he demanded. The devoted wife maintaining her perfect position while planning the complete destruction of the man who thought he could diminish her in front of Chicago's financial elite. The housekeeper badge would be his masterpiece of cruelty. But the SEC filing would be mine. 2 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday afternoon that threatened rain, Zoe showed up at our townhouse without calling first. She stood on our doorstep with mascara streaking down her cheeks, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing sweatpants and a Northwestern hoodie that made her look like the college student she'd been before Daniel Morrison swept her into his world of tech startups and venture capital promises. "I think I'm making a terrible mistake," she said, and I pulled her inside before any neighbors could see a hawthorn crying in public. God forbid word got back to Serafina that her youngest daughter had shown weakness where people might witness it. We sat in my kitchen while I made tea, proper tea with loose leaves in a pot, not the bags Alexander insisted were fine. Zoe's engagement ring caught the light. 3 carats surrounded by smaller diamonds, the kind of ring that announced wealth before the wearer even spoke. She twisted it around her finger like it was burning her. "Daniel wants to get married next month," she said, her voice small. "He says there's no point waiting, that we should just do it before his company goes public. He gets angry when I suggest waiting until spring." I kept my face neutral while my mind raced. Daniel Morrison ran a fintech startup called Pure Metrics that claimed to revolutionize payment processing for small businesses. Alexander had mentioned it twice at dinner, impressed by their growth numbers. But something in Zoe's voice made my consultant instincts flare. "Tell me about the anger," I said carefully, pouring her tea. "It's not real anger. It's pressure." Like when he showed me the prenup his lawyers drafted. Apparently, I need to sign away rights to his company, any future companies, and agree to confidentiality about his business dealings. When I asked to have my own lawyer review it, he said I was being dramatic. That night after Zoe left, I did what I do best, research. Daniel's company showed impressive metrics on paper. 2 million users. 40% quarter-over-quarter growth. Partnerships with 3 major banks. But I knew how to read between the numbers. My contacts at the banks had never heard of pure metrics. The user growth followed patterns I'd seen in fraudulent companies. Too linear, too consistent, lacking the organic fluctuations of real adoption. By morning I had the truth. Daniel was inflating metrics to secure his Series B funding. The 2 million users were mostly bots. The banking partnerships were letters of intent, not actual contracts. His company was 3 months from imploding, and he needed to marry Zoe quickly to lock down her trust fund as emergency runway. I documented everything in a secure folder, but telling Zoe would require timing. She needed to discover this naturally, not have her defensive about her choices. 3 days after Zoe's visit, Serafina called my cell directly. She never called Alexander about money, only me. "Victoria, darling," she began, which meant she wanted something expensive. "There's been a small hiccup with the estate taxes from Richard's passing." Richard had been dead for 2 years. Estate taxes were long settled. "It's rather urgent," she continued. $50,000 due by month's end. My divorce settlement is tied up in some tedious legal matter. You understand how these things go. I understood perfectly. The woman who'd just posted Instagram photos from her street Bart's vacation, who'd bought a new Range Rover last month, who wore different Cartier watches to each Thursday dinner, needed $50,000 for imaginary taxes. "Of course," I said smoothly. "Send me the tax documentation and I'll handle the payment directly to the IRS." Silence. Then, "Oh, it's easier if you just transfer it to my account. I'll handle the paperwork." I agreed, transferred the money, and immediately hired a forensic accountant through my company. What he found was remarkable. During her divorce from Richard's brother William, Serafina had hidden $2.3 million in Cayman Islands accounts. She'd claimed poverty in court, walking away with massive alimony payments while sitting on a fortune that should have been split. The $50,000 I'd just sent was probably funding her next shopping spree while she played the victim of bureaucratic delays. Meanwhile, Alexander had become a ghost in our marriage. 3 months ago he'd missed our anniversary dinner, claiming an emergency with a portfolio company. I'd sat alone at Gibson's Steakhouse, watching the candle burn down while the waiter tried not to look pitying. On my birthday last month, he'd forgotten entirely until his assistant reminded him at 4 p.m., then he'd sent grocery store flowers with a generic card. But the Friday meetings were what really told the story. Every Friday for 3 months, Alexander had emergency partner meetings at the Palmer House Hotel. He'd leave his phone in the car, claiming the partners demanded complete focus. He'd return smelling of perfume that wasn't mine, Chanel No. 5, expensive and cliché. His collar would have makeup traces he'd tried to wipe away. His credit card statements, which I handled because he couldn't be bothered with administrative tasks, showed charges for room service for 2 champagne and breakfast. I knew her name. Rebecca Lansing, senior associate at Lakeshore Capital, Harvard MBA, engaged to someone else but apparently flexible about exclusivity. I had photos from the hotel security footage my investigator procured. They were damning and clear. But I filed them away with the embezzlement evidence, building my arsenal while pretending to be the oblivious wife focused on her little business. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered by courier. Gold embossing on cream cardstock so thick it could stand on its own. "The honor of your presence is requested at the engagement celebration of Zoe Elise Hawthorne and Daniel Morrison. Addressed to Mr. Alexander Hawthorne. Only him. Where's mine?" I asked at dinner, holding the invitation. Alexander barely glanced up from his phone where he was probably texting Rebecca about their next Friday meeting. "Mom probably forgot to include your name. You know how she is with details." Serafina Hawthorne had never forgotten a detail in her life. She remembered the thread count of her sheets, the vintage of wines served at dinners 3 years ago, and exactly how much everyone's jewelry cost at every event. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. "Should I RSVP for both of us?" I asked, testing him. Obviously you're coming, he said, finally looking at me with irritation that I'd interrupted whatever flirtation he was conducting via text. Just wear something understated. You know, so you don't outshine the bride. Something understated. Like I was the kind of woman who would show up to his sister's engagement party in sequins and steal attention. Like my very presence needed to be diminished, made smaller, less noticeable. Like I should practice being invisible before they made it official with a name badge. That night I stood in our closet looking at my clothes. The DVF dresses he'd once said made me look like I belonged. The St. John suits I wore to client meetings. The careful, calculated wardrobe of a woman trying to fit into a world that had already decided she didn't belong. I pulled out a black dress, simple and elegant, the kind of thing you could wear to a business dinner or a funeral. It would be perfect for what was coming. Saturday arrived wrapped in late September chill, the kind that made you reach for a coat but then realize you'd look overdressed. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror at 6:30, the black dress hanging perfectly, my makeup applied with the precision of someone preparing for battle rather than celebration. The exhaustion I saw reflected back went deeper than sleepless nights reviewing spreadsheets. This was the bone-deep weariness of maintaining a marriage that had become performance art. Alexander had left 2 hours earlier for client drinks before the party. The same client drinks that required cologne reapplication and a fresh shirt, even though he'd supposedly been at the office all day. He'd kissed my cheek absently, told me not to wait for him, that he'd meet me at Crystal Gardens. The casual cruelty of making me arrive alone to his sister's engagement party didn't even register on his face. I drove myself in the Mercedes winding through Lincoln Park toward the venue. The car still smelled faintly of the leather conditioning Alexander insisted on monthly, another one of those details that mattered more than whether his wife had someone to walk in with. At every red light I checked my phone, confirming James Fitzgerald had received the encrypted files, that Margaret Brennan was on standby, that my documenting of this evening would be admissible if needed. Crystal Gardens' valet lot was already full of cars that cost more than most people's houses. I pulled in between a white Bentley and a black Maserati, both probably belonging to Alexander's partners who viewed marriages as merger opportunities and wives as either assets or liabilities on their social balance sheets. The valet was young, maybe 22, probably working his way through college. He took my keys with the kind of deference reserved for people who could afford to be here. Inside, the lobby gleamed with that particular combination of marble and ambition that characterized Chicago's elite venues. Clusters of Alexander's colleagues stood near the bar, and I heard my name drift from their conversation. "That's the one who thinks she's a business consultant," someone said, not quite quietly enough. "Alexander lets her play CO with that little company of hers." They laughed, the sound sharp as champagne flutes clinking. I walked past them toward the check-in table, my heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision. Each step was deliberate, controlled, the walk of someone who belonged even when every whisper suggested otherwise. The table was draped in ivory linen, attended by a young woman wearing pearls that probably cost more than her monthly salary. "Victoria Hawthorne," I said clearly. She smiled, began flipping through her list. The smile faltered. She flipped again, running her manicured finger down the names. A third time, slower now, and I watched pink creep up her neck. "I'm sorry, could you repeat the name?" "Victoria Hawthorne. H.W. Horney." She looked up at me with genuine distress, then down at something beneath the table. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a badge tucked separately from the others. She slid it across the marble counter just as Serafina materialized beside me in champagne-colored Chanel, timed with the precision of someone who'd been watching for this exact moment. The badge read Victoria Housekeeper in elegant script. "Oh, Victoria," Serafina announced, her voice pitched to carry across the lobby. "You're just staff here." The words landed like a judge's verdict. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Investment bankers turned from their whiskey. Hedge fund managers paused their networking. 300 of Chicago's financial elite suddenly had their evening's entertainment, watching Serafina Hawthorne publicly designate her daughter-in-law as hired help. Behind me, someone whispered, "The one who saved Hawthorne Manufacturing?" Another voice responded, "Apparently she's the housekeeper now." Someone actually took a photo with their phone. I picked up the badge, studying it like evidence in a deposition. The cardstock was expensive, the printing professional. This wasn't a last-minute error. This had been ordered weeks ago, approved, paid for, and deliberately separated from the guest badges. Shall I escort you to the service entrance? Serafina asked sweetly. The staff usually enters through the back. I clipped the badge to my dress with steady hands and walked into the ballroom. Table 3 was positioned perfectly for maximum visibility, close enough to the head table for importance, far enough from the exit to prevent discreet departure. 7 chairs surrounded 8 place settings, the gap where my seat should have been screaming louder than any announcement. The empty space had been carefully maintained, no one had accidentally shifted the chairs to fill it. This was architectural humiliation. I stood beside the void where my place should have been, watching Serafina's friends notice the missing chair, see my badge and understand tonight's entertainment. The mayor's wife actually gasped. A federal judge's husband took out his phone to text someone, probably sharing the delicious gossip of Victoria Hawthorne's public demotion. Alexander arrived 40 minutes later and yes, I was still standing. He swept in with the confidence of someone who'd had exactly 3 whiskeys, enough for courage but not enough to slur. His collar had lipstick traces he hadn't bothered to check. Rebecca's shade, that coral pink she wore to every company event. The smell of her Chanel No. 5 clouded around him like evidence. He saw me standing. Saw the missing chair. Saw his mother's satisfied smile. Saw his partners from Lakeshore Capital watching from 2 tables over. And he laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an uncomfortable laugh. A genuine, amused laugh like someone had told a particularly clever joke. Relax, Victoria, he said, reaching for the wine already poured at his place setting. Food is for family. Food is for family. 5 years of marriage, 3 years of building a company that saved businesses, 18 months ago rescuing his father's entire manufacturing legacy, and I wasn't family enough for a chair. For a plate. For basic dignity in front of people whose respect he desperately craved. I felt that crystalline moment of clarity that comes when a marriage dies. Not the slow death of falling out of love, but the instant death of realizing you were never loved at all. I was an accessory that had become inconvenient, a supporting actress who'd forgotten she wasn't supposed to have her own storylines. I reached for my wedding ring, the 2-carat diamond Alexander had chosen to impress his partners rather than please me. The metal was warm from my skin, familiar after 5 years of never taking it off. I pulled it off with deliberate slowness, letting the overhead lights catch every facet of the diamond. The movement drew attention. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. Someone actually set down their fork mid-bite. I placed the ring on the white tablecloth with a precision that made the soft click echo. The sound carried further than it should have, silencing tables in expanding ripples like dropped stones in still water. Then I'm no longer yours, I said, my voice clear and carrying. Alexander's laugh died. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, embarrassment, then the dawning realization that I was serious. That his wife had just removed her wedding ring in front of Chicago's entire financial ecosystem. That the woman he'd designated as the housekeeper had just quit her position. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels marking each step against the marble. Behind me, chaos erupted, chairs scraping, voices rising, Serafina's sharp, Alexander, do something. But I didn't turn around. 300 members of Chicago's elite would remember this night, would tell the story at other parties, would wonder what kind of man laughed while his wife stood without a chair. They thought they'd witnessed the culmination. They were wrong. This was just the opening act. The parking garage at Crystal Gardens was eerily quiet after the chaos I'd left behind. My hands were steady on the Mercedes steering wheel, steadier than they'd been in months of pretending everything was fine. I pulled out my phone and called James Fitzgerald. 3 rings. He picked up even though it was nearly 9 on a Saturday night. Execute Project Revelation, I said without preamble. There was a pause, just a heartbeat, then his voice came through clear and professional. Confirming execution of Project Revelation. Asset freeze protocols initiating now. Document preservation complete. SEC filing prepared for submission. 6 months ago, I'd sat in James's office with a banker's box of evidence. Copies of Alexander's doctored reports, diverted funds, investor money traced to personal accounts. James had reviewed everything with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent 10 years at Deloitte before joining my firm. This is prison-level fraud, he'd said quietly. We'd built Project Revelation that day. A complete response plan for when, not if, Alexander's betrayal became unbearable. The accounts will be frozen within the hour, James continued. Our forensic accountant has everything documented. Margaret Brennan has been notified. I drove home through the quiet streets of Lincoln Park, passing houses where normal families were having normal Saturday nights. No public humiliation. No housekeeper badges. No missing chairs at family tables. The townhouse was dark when I arrived. Of course Alexander hadn't come home. He was probably still at Crystal Gardens, trying to explain to his partners why his wife had just staged a public separation at a society event. I poured myself exactly 1 glass of wine and opened my laptop in the home office. The SEC's whistleblower portal loaded slowly, like it was giving me time to reconsider. I didn't need time. Each file I uploaded was tagged meticulously: Lakeshore Capital Fund 3 misallocation, personal expense documentation, falsified portfolio company reports. 27 files in total, each one a nail in the professional coffin Alexander had built himself. My phone buzzed. Alexander. I let it ring through to voicemail. Then again. And again. By the 5th call I was curious enough to check the caller ID. Different numbers, his office line, his cell, the partner's conference room. By midnight I had 17 missed calls. I finally listened to the voicemail he'd left after attempt number 12. Victoria, this is ridiculous. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Call me back. His voice was controlled, lawyerly, the tone he used with difficult clients. The 13th call's message was different. We need to discuss this rationally. You're emotional. Let's talk through whatever's bothering you. By the 16th message, desperation had crept in. The partners are asking questions. Do you understand what you're doing? You're destroying everything we've built. Everything we've built. As if he'd contributed anything to my company beyond condescension. As if his embezzlement and affairs were building rather than destroying. At 5:30 Sunday morning my doorbell rang. Margaret Brennan stood on my porch in a pristine suit despite the ungodly hour, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's rent. She'd driven straight from her Lake Forest home after James's call. Let's review your options, she said, spreading manila folders across my dining room table like she was dealing cards in the world's highest stakes poker game. The first folder contained Alexander's greatest hits of infidelity. Photos from the Palmer House Hotel, time-stamped credit card receipts, sworn affidavits from hotel staff who'd been paid to look the other way. Rebecca Lansing featured prominently, but she wasn't alone. There was Jennifer from the Hong Kong trip. Maria from the Miami conference. Each documented with the precision of someone building a case. The prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause is ironclad, Margaret explained, tapping a specific paragraph with her manicured nail. Full forfeiture of marital asset claims, plus damages for reputational harm. He gets nothing from your company, nothing from your accounts, and he owes you compensation. The second folder was even more damaging. Lakeshore Capital's fraudulent fund allocations laid out in spreadsheet clarity. Investor money diverted to personal accounts, then cleverly disguised as portfolio company expenses. Classic embezzlement wearing a private equity costume. This is federal crime territory, Margaret said quietly. Once the SEC receives this, there's no stopping the investigation. His partners will distance themselves immediately. Criminal charges are likely. The third folder contained my nuclear option, Serafina's hidden offshore accounts. $2 million that should have been split in her divorce, hidden in the Caymans while she cried poverty to the court. Her ex-husband's attorney would find this very interesting, Margaret noted. The clawback provisions alone would bankrupt her. We worked through each document, each strategy, each potential outcome. Margaret had the kind of thorough preparation that came from 20 years of destroying wealthy men who thought they were untouchable. By the time she left at noon, I had a clear path forward. It would be brutal, methodical, and entirely legal. That evening, still Sunday, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, then noticed the 847 area code. Northwestern University. Victoria. The voice was small, scared. It's Zoe. I'm in your lobby. Can I come up? She stood at my door 5 minutes later looking destroyed. Pajama pants under a Northwestern sweatshirt, no makeup, mascara streaks still visible from crying. In her hands she clutched printed pages with highlighting and handwritten notes in the margins. I researched Daniel's company, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After what you said about checking things, the numbers don't add up. I made tea while she spread her research across my kitchen counter. She'd done good work, better than I'd expected from someone with no financial background. User growth charts that showed impossible patterns. Partnership announcements that led to dead websites. Employee LinkedIn profiles for people who didn't exist. It's all fake, isn't it? She asked, looking at me with eyes that already knew the answer. We sat on my kitchen floor, backs against the cabinets, sharing tea and truth. I explained how I'd discovered the fraud, why I'd waited to tell her, how Daniel was using their engagement to access her trust fund before his company collapsed. You were protecting me, she said slowly. While Mom was calling you the housekeeper while Alexander was. She trailed off, fresh tears starting. You were the only one who was ever kind to me, I told her honestly. When I married Alexander, you welcomed me. You never made me feel like I didn't belong. You were the only one who actually acted like family, she whispered. We talked until nearly midnight, planning how she'd confront Daniel, how she'd protect herself legally and financially. I gave her Margaret Brennan's card, promising to cover the legal fees myself. When she finally left, she hugged me with the desperation of someone who just realized how alone she'd been in her own family. I stood in my empty townhouse afterward, surrounded by the evidence of systematic betrayal and calculated cruelty. Tomorrow the documents would be filed. The accounts would be frozen. The investigations would begin. The Hawthorne family empire would start its collapse. But tonight, in my kitchen with Zoe, I'd remembered why I was doing this. Not just for revenge, though that would be satisfying, but because someone had to protect the people they claimed to love while destroying. Someone had to be the family they pretended to be. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, clearer. I was already at my desk when the first domino fell at exactly 8 o'clock. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from a number I knew well, Serafina's private line. I played it on speaker while reviewing my morning emails. You vindictive little nobody. Her voice crackled through the speaker, high-pitched and frantic. How dare you? Do you have any idea what you've done? William's attorney just served me papers. They know about the Cayman accounts. They know everything. The message continued for 3 more minutes, alternating between threats of legal action and desperate attempts at negotiation. She used words I'd never heard from her perfectly painted lips before. The polished Gold Coast matron had cracked completely, revealing the desperate woman underneath who'd hidden $2 million while claiming she couldn't afford groceries during her divorce. I deleted the voicemail and opened an email from Margaret Brennan. The subject line read simply, clawback initiated. William's attorney had filed emergency motions that morning. Serafina's accounts were frozen pending investigation. She owed $800,000 in penalties plus the original $2 million she'd concealed. Her Range Rover would be repossessed by week's end. At 9:15 my phone rang. James Fitzgerald calling from his car. You need to see something, he said without greeting. Check your email. Security footage from Lakeshore Capital just leaked. The video was grainy but clear enough. Alexander in his corner office at 7:43 that morning, reading something on his computer screen. His face went from confused to panicked to enraged in the span of 30 seconds. Then he picked up his laptop and hurled it against the glass wall of his office with enough force to leave a spiderweb crack. The sound of shattering technology mixed with his screaming at his assistant to get his lawyer immediately. What the security footage captured next was even more damaging. 3 junior analysts standing frozen in the hallway, phones raised, recording their boss's complete breakdown. Alexander screaming obscenities. Papers flying. Him trying to call someone, probably me, and throwing his phone when I didn't answer. It's already viral, James said. #Hawthorne meltdown. Every financial blog in Chicago has picked it up. By noon the video had been viewed 40,000 times. Someone had set it to classical music, making Alexander's rage look even more unhinged against Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The comments section was brutal. Former employees sharing stories about his temper. Competitors questioning his stability. Investors asking if this was who they'd trusted with their pension funds. I watched it once, noting the exact moment the SEC notice must have appeared on his screen. That would be the formal notification of investigation into Lakeshore Capital's fund allocations. The moment he realized his career was over, that prison was a real possibility, that his perfectly crafted image had shattered like his laptop screen. Wednesday arrived with its own special delivery of consequences. Serafina called me 6 times before noon, each message more desperate than the last. I didn't answer, but Zoe forwarded me the text their mother had sent to the family group chat. The Chicago Athletic Club has made a terrible mistake. Some confusion about finances. This will be resolved immediately. But there was no confusion. The club had suspended her membership pending resolution of her legal troubles. The same establishment where she'd held court for 20 years, where she'd served on committees and organized galas, had politely but firmly exiled her. Her Wednesday tennis partner, Dorothy Whitfield, had reportedly walked past her in the lobby without acknowledgement. The same woman who'd been Serafina's maid of honor at her wedding to William now pretended they'd never met. Zoe called me that afternoon, her voice a mixture of shock and something close to satisfaction. Mom showed up for her tennis match and they had her locker contents boxed in the lobby, she said. Security escorted her out. Everyone saw. Mrs. Chin actually took a photo. The mighty Serafina Hawthorne, reduced to carrying a cardboard box of tennis whites and designer athletic wear through a lobby full of people she'd once considered beneath her notice. The Chicago Society pages would feast on this for months. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. James arrived at my home office with a folder and an expression I'd learned to recognize. He'd found an opportunity in chaos. Crystal Gardens is in trouble, he said, spreading financial statements across my desk. The venue's hemorrhaging money. Bad management, worse contracts. They're looking for a buyer before they go under. I studied the numbers. The same venue where I'd been labeled the housekeeper was now begging for rescue. The irony was delicious enough to taste. How much? I asked. They're asking $2 million. They'll take $800,000 cash. 40 cents on the dollar. We could run it through the shell company, make it a Nexus Advisory acquisition. $800,000 to own the site of my humiliation. To control the space where 300 people had witnessed my degradation. To ensure no one else would ever endure what I had experienced there. Draw up the papers, I said without hesitation. James smiled, the kind of expression that reminded me why I'd hired him from Deloitte. He understood that revenge was just business by another name. I've already started. We can close by month's end. Full transfer of assets, including their existing event contracts. Serafina's charity gala is booked there for December. The charity gala. Serafina's crown jewel event, the one she spent all year planning, where she proved her social relevance by raising money for causes she couldn't pronounce correctly. She'd already sent invitations. The deposits were paid. And soon I'd own the venue. We'll honor existing contracts, I said carefully. With some modifications to policies. James raised an eyebrow. Modifications. You rules. No degrading name badges. No missing chairs. No class distinctions in service. Everyone who enters gets treated with equal dignity. And Serafina's gala? Will proceed as planned. She'll just have to follow the new policies. And perhaps we'll display the venue's ownership prominently. You know, for transparency. That afternoon I signed the initial papers while thinking about the badge that still sat in my desk drawer. The one that read Victoria Housekeeper. Soon I'd own the building where that humiliation occurred. I'd control the space where Alexander laughed at my missing chair. I'd decide who was welcome and who wasn't. The acquisition documents felt heavier than their actual weight, loaded with the promise of transformation. Crystal Gardens would become something different under my ownership. A place where respect wasn't determined by bank accounts or bloodlines. Where every person who entered would be treated as equally valuable. Where no one would ever stand beside an empty chair while their spouse laughed. As James gathered the papers to file with our attorneys, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Rebecca Lansing, Alexander's mistress. He's been calling me non-stop. Begging for help. I thought you should know I'm testifying to the SEC tomorrow. I kept records of everything. The gifts, the trips, all paid with investor funds. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. Even his mistress was abandoning ship. The dominoes weren't just falling anymore. They were accelerating, each collapse triggering the next with beautiful precision. I stared at Rebecca's text for a moment longer before setting my phone aside. Tomorrow she would testify to the SEC, and Alexander's last potential lifeline would be severed. The irony that his mistress would show more integrity than he ever had wasn't lost on me. I pulled up the emails from the 3 portfolio companies where Nexus Advisory held consulting contracts through Lakeshore Capital's agreements. Each CO owed their company's survival to my restructuring work, though Alexander had taken credit for sourcing exceptional consultants at every partners meeting. Friday morning I sent identical emails to all 3 CEOs. The message was simple. Evidence of fund misallocation affecting their companies, urgent board review recommended, documentation attached. By 9:30 my phone was ringing off the hook. Michael Chin from Pinnacle Tech was first. Victoria, these documents, is this real? Alexander's been charging personal expenses to our operational budget. Every receipt is authenticated, I told him. Your last quarter's unusually high consulting fees actually paid for his Palmer House hotel stays. The emergency board meeting at Lakeshore Capital convened at 11. I wasn't there, but Michael Chin called me from the bathroom during a break, whispering like he was sharing state secrets. It's chaos, he said. The limited partners are losing their minds. Someone calculated that Alexander misallocated $3.2 million over 18 months. They're talking criminal prosecution. By 3 o'clock it was over. Alexander was placed on indefinite leave, his equity stake frozen pending investigation, and his company access revoked immediately. The security footage that leaked later showed him packing personal items into a cardboard box while 2 guards watched, ensuring he didn't take any files. The same corner office where he'd thrown his laptop now hosted his professional funeral. His assistant apparently wouldn't make eye contact as he left. That evening Zoe called me sobbing, but they were different tears than before. These carried relief mixed with anger. I confronted Daniel with everything, she said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. At first he denied it, said I was being paranoid, that I didn't understand startup metrics. Then I showed him the evidence you helped me compile. She described how Daniel had crumbled completely, falling to his knees in their Lincoln Park apartment, admitting he'd inflated Pure Metrics user numbers by 90%. The 2 million users were mostly bots he'd purchased from a Romanian developer. The banking partnerships existed only in draft proposals. Everything was designed to secure funding before the truth emerged. He kept saying he could make it right, Zoe continued, disgust creeping into her voice. As if fraud could be fixed with good intentions. He actually suggested we get married quickly so I couldn't testify against him. She'd ended the engagement via group text to avoid individual confrontations with people who'd only befriended her for her trust fund. The message was brief: wedding's off. Please don't contact me. Her phone had exploded with messages ranging from fake concern to angry demands for explanation. She'd blocked them all. You saved me from becoming a federal defendant's wife, she said quietly. From visiting him in prison, from having my assets seized, from losing everything to his crimes. At 2 in the morning my doorbell camera detected motion. The alert on my phone showed Alexander standing on my porch, swaying slightly. His Brooks Brothers suit, usually pristine, was wrinkled and stained. His tie hung loose around his neck. He looked like what he was, a man whose entire world had collapsed in less than a week. Victoria, he shouted loud enough to wake neighbors. Open the door. We need to talk. I watched through the camera feed as he alternated between pounding on the door and leaning against it for support. The recording would be perfect evidence for the restraining order Margaret Brennan would file at courthouse opening. I know you're watching, he slurred, looking directly at the camera. You think you've won? I'll destroy your little company. I'll tell everyone what you really are. What I really was. A woman who'd saved his family's business, supported his career, and built her own success despite his constant diminishment? The threat might have scared me once. Now it was just pathetic noise from a man who'd lost all his power. We can work this out, he continued, his tone shifting to desperate pleading. It was just a joke, the badge thing. Mom's idea. You know I love you. Love. He threw the word around like it meant something, like it could erase the housekeeper badge, the missing chair, the laughter when I stood without a place at the table. Through the camera I watched him slide down to sit on the porch steps, his head in his hands. The mighty Alexander Hawthorne, reduced to drunk, begging on the doorstep of the woman he'd tried to humiliate. After 20 minutes he finally left, stumbling toward an Uber that charged the credit card I hadn't yet removed my name from. I'd fixed that in the morning along with filing the restraining order. For now, I had 20 minutes of recorded evidence of harassment, threats, and trespassing. Saturday afternoon brought the most unexpected revelation. James had been tracking the Hawthorne family's financial collapse through his network of contacts. What he discovered about Serafina's current situation exceeded even my expectations for poetic justice. She's working as a receptionist, he told me over coffee in my home office, at a dental practice in Naperville. $15 an hour plus benefits. The woman who'd declared me just staff was now actually working as staff. The woman who'd said food was for family was probably bringing packed lunches to save money. The woman who'd measured worth in designer labels and trust fund zeros was taking public transportation because her Range Rover had been repossessed Thursday morning. She's living in a one-bedroom apartment near the metro station, James continued, showing me property records on his tablet. $1,200 a month. Her Gold Coast mansion was seized yesterday for the fraud penalties. I thought about Serafina sitting behind a reception desk, scheduling appointments for people who didn't know she used to host charity galas in that same suburb. Answering phones with the same voice that had announced to 300 people that I was the housekeeper. Filing insurance forms for the kind of middle-class families she'd once considered beneath her notice. The other receptionists apparently have no idea who she used to be, James added. She goes by Sarah now. Sarah Whitmore. Told them she's divorced, starting over. Starting over at 62 with nothing but an hourly wage and a benefits package she desperately needed for health insurance. The same age when most of her former friends were planning Mediterranean cruises and complaining about estate taxes she'd never have to worry about again. That evening, I stood in my townhouse looking at the physical evidence of the week's destruction. Alexander's belongings still cluttered half the closet. Suits that would probably be sold to pay legal fees, watches that would be seized as fraudulently purchased assets, the cufflinks I'd given him for our anniversary that he'd never worn because they weren't expensive enough to impress his partners. On my desk sat the contract for Crystal Gardens, waiting for final signatures. The housekeeper badge lay beside it, a reminder of the moment they'd revealed their true nature. In trying to diminish me, they'd freed me to become who I really was. Not the supportive wife making herself smaller for her husband's ego, but a woman capable of systematic, legal, complete destruction of those who'd mistaken kindness for weakness. The Hawthorne family empire hadn't fallen. It had been methodically demolished brick by brick, until nothing remained but rubble and regret. I signed the final papers for Crystal Gardens on a Monday morning that felt like the first day of a new life. The venue was mine now, every marble column and crystal chandelier, every inch of the space where they'd tried to erase me. James had arranged for the press conference to be held that Wednesday at 2 o'clock, precisely when Serafina's charity gala planning committee would have been meeting for their final preparations. The main ballroom looked different in daylight, less imposing somehow. I stood at the podium they'd set up, looking out at the assembled reporters, local business owners, and representatives from various Chicago community organizations. The same room where I'd been denied a chair now held 50 people who'd come to hear my vision for the venue's future. Crystal Gardens will operate under new principles, I announced, my voice steady and clear through the microphone. Effective immediately, we're eliminating all hierarchical seating arrangements and demeaning identification practices. Every guest, regardless of their bank account or bloodline, will be treated with equal dignity and respect. I held up a sample of our new name badges. Simple, elegant, just names without titles or designations. No one would ever be labeled as housekeeper or staff or anything designed to diminish them. Additionally, I continued, we're launching the Community Celebration Initiative. Once monthly, Crystal Gardens will be available free of charge to immigrant families celebrating milestones, weddings, graduations, citizenship ceremonies. Because everyone deserves a beautiful space for their important moments. Not just those born into privilege. A reporter from the Tribune raised her hand. Mrs. Hawthorne, what about existing bookings? We understand there was a major charity gala scheduled for December. All existing contracts will be honored with our new policies in place, I said carefully. However, any events that cannot comply with our standards of equal treatment will need to find alternative venues. We've already issued full refunds where necessary. Serafina's gala, the crown jewel of her social calendar, was officially dead. Her deposit had been returned that morning, along with a polite note explaining that Crystal Gardens could no longer accommodate events that practiced social stratification. The woman who'd orchestrated my humiliation would have to find somewhere else to pretend she still mattered to Chicago society. As the press conference ended, my phone buzzed with a call from Margaret Brennan. The federal investigation had released its findings that morning. Alexander's crimes were worse than even I had documented. $3.2 million embezzled over 18 months, systematically stolen from investors who'd trusted him with their retirement funds and college endowments. "They're seizing everything," Margaret explained. "The townhouse goes to auction next month. Both Porsches, the boat he kept at Belmont Harbor, even his watch collection. The Patek Philippe he wore to show off at partner meetings? It was purchased with stolen funds. The townhouse where I'd made his coffee every morning, where I'd pressed his shirts while he planned my humiliation, would be sold to the highest bidder. His precious vintage Porsche 911, the one he spent weekends polishing while I saved failing businesses, would end up in someone else's garage. Every symbol of his success was being stripped away, revealing the fraud beneath the facade. His legal defense is costing $400,000 and climbing," Margaret continued. "The family trust his grandfather established is nearly depleted. There won't be anything left for appeals." That afternoon, an unexpected email arrived from Helena Morrison, senior partner at Lakeshore Capital. She wanted to meet privately away from the office at a quiet coffee shop in Wicker Park. I almost declined, then curiosity won. Helena looked older than she had at the engagement party, stress lines evident despite her careful makeup. She stood when I arrived, a gesture of respect she wouldn't have offered 2 weeks ago. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I suspected Alexander was misallocating funds 6 months ago. Small discrepancies, nothing I could prove. I should have investigated harder." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were contact information for 12 CEOs in her network, all running companies that needed restructuring expertise. "These executives value integrity over connections," she said. "They need someone who can save their businesses without destroying their employees' lives. I've already made the introductions. They're expecting your calls." 3 of those calls resulted in immediate contracts worth over 7 figures each. Within a week, Nexus Advisory had more work than we could handle, requiring me to hire 6 new consultants to manage the overflow. We were no longer my little business, but Chicago's premier restructuring firm, sought after by companies that wanted honest solutions rather than financial engineering tricks. The following Friday, I attended the Chicago Women in Business Conference at the Hilton downtown. I wasn't scheduled to speak, just planning to network and possibly recruit new talent for our expanding team. Then the moderator announced a surprise speaker for the session on professional integrity. Zoe walked onto the stage wearing a simple black suit, her hair pulled back, looking nothing like the girl who'd cried in my kitchen about her rushed engagement. She commanded the podium with newfound confidence. 2 months ago, I was planning a wedding to a man who was committing federal fraud, she began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. I would have married him, tied my future to his crimes, if not for one person who cared enough to tell me the truth. She looked directly at me in the 3rd row. Victoria Hawthorne saved me from becoming collateral damage in someone else's deception. While my own family orchestrated public humiliation against her, she quietly protected me from a catastrophic mistake. The audience of 500 professional women listened in rapt attention as Zoe described discovering Daniel's fraud, calling off the engagement, and using the money from selling her engagement ring to fund her MBA at University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. "Real family," she said, her voice growing stronger, "protects you from harm. Real family tells you difficult truths. Real family stands up for you when the world tries to diminish you. Victoria taught me that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about choosing to protect people even when they're connected to those who've hurt you." The applause was thunderous. Women throughout the auditorium stood, recognizing something universal in the story of being underestimated, dismissed, and ultimately triumphant. I hadn't sought this recognition, hadn't wanted public vindication, but sitting there watching Zoe claim her own power, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. After the conference, Zoe found me in the lobby. She hugged me with fierce gratitude, then pulled back to show me her laptop screen. "Look," she said, pointing to an email. I got accepted to the Booth Scholars Program. Full scholarship based on my essay about recognizing and escaping financial fraud. They want me to help develop a new curriculum on ethical business practices. The girl who'd been marrying for status was now building a career on substance. The woman who'd been passive in her family's cruelty had found her voice. The sister who'd stood by while I was humiliated had become the only family worth claiming. That evening I stood in Crystal Garden's main ballroom, now empty except for the maintenance staff preparing for tomorrow's event. A citizenship ceremony for 30 immigrant families who would celebrate in the space where I'd been told I wasn't family enough for a chair. The bitter irony had transformed into something sweeter, something that tasted like justice served at exactly the right temperature. The maintenance staff had finished their preparations, leaving Crystal Gardens pristine for tomorrow's citizenship ceremony. I walked through the quiet ballroom, my footsteps echoing against marble that held different memories now. Exactly 1 year had passed since the engagement party, since the night they tried to erase me with a missing chair and a degrading badge. Tonight I would host my own gathering in this same space, but this time, every chair would be filled with people who understood that worth wasn't measured in trust funds or family names. James arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine from Giuseppe's private collection. The pizzeria owner I'd saved 3 years ago insisted on sending his best vintage when he heard about tonight's dinner. Margaret Brennan came next, having driven straight from court where she'd been defending another whistleblower against corporate retaliation. Tony Romano brought homemade tiramisu from his restaurant, the one that would have closed without my intervention. Lisa Chong, who owned the Chinese restaurant on North Avenue that I'd restructured last year, arrived with her daughter who'd just graduated from Northwestern thanks to the business staying afloat. And then Zoe walked in, transformed from the girl who'd cried in my kitchen to a confident woman carrying herself like she belonged anywhere she chose to be. She wore a simple navy dress, no designer labels necessary to announce her worth. 1 year, she said, looking around the ballroom. Hard to believe this is where it all started falling apart. Or maybe where it all started coming together. We sat at a round table I'd deliberately chosen. No head, no hierarchy, just equals sharing a meal. The conversation flowed naturally, stories of businesses saved and families preserved, of second chances and new beginnings. Tony's son had taken over the restaurant and was innovating the menu while keeping his grandmother's recipes. Lisa's expansion to a second location was ahead of projections. The laughter was genuine, born from shared struggles and mutual respect rather than nervous networking. To resilience, James raised his glass. And to Victoria, who showed us that being dismissed as just staff can be the beginning of becoming indispensable. After dinner, I drove to my new office in the West Loop, a space I'd chosen specifically because it wasn't in the financial district where Alexander's former colleagues congregated. The building was modern but approachable, glass and steel softened by exposed brick and warm lighting. My office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor, with windows facing west toward neighborhoods full of small businesses that needed saving. On the wall between my MBA diploma from Kellogg and the framed first check from Giuseppe's, my first paying client, hung the Housekeeper badge. I'd had it professionally mounted with museum-quality glass, the cream cardstock preserved perfectly, the elegant script still clear, Victoria Housekeeper. Every struggling business owner who sat across from my desk could see it. When they asked, which they always did, I told them the story. How the badge meant to diminish me had become my motivation. How being labeled staff had freed me to stop seeking approval from people who would never give it. How the greatest strength sometimes came from those others dismissed as unworthy. It reminds me, I would tell them, that your current circumstances don't define your future capabilities. That badge was supposed to be my designation. Instead, it became my declaration. The following morning, Margaret Brennan called with Alexander's latest communication. He'd sent a letter through his court-appointed attorney, since he could no longer afford private counsel. Margaret read it to me over the phone, her voice carrying subtle amusement at its contents. Dear Victoria, it began. I'm writing from Milwaukee where I've taken a position as a junior analyst with Midwest Financial Services. It's a small firm, but they were willing to overlook certain past difficulties. I live with my parents now in the house where I grew up. It's humbling but perhaps necessary. The letter went on for 2 pages, weaving between self-pity and revisionist history. He claimed the engagement party incident was misunderstood, that the name badge was an unfortunate error, that his mother had acted without his knowledge. He begged me to consider dropping the charges, though we both knew criminal prosecution was beyond my control now. Federal investigators didn't care about personal forgiveness. How should I respond? Margaret asked. One word, I said. No. She laughed. I'll draft something appropriately brief. That evening I stood in my Lincoln Park penthouse as dawn painted Lake Michigan in shades of rose and gold. I wore flannel pajamas and thick socks, comfort clothes that would have horrified Serafina with their lack of designer labels. No one was watching, no one was judging, no one was measuring my worth by my appearance. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, displaying expansion plans for Nexus Advisory's second office in Detroit. We'd identified 40 struggling businesses there that could benefit from our restructuring expertise. The city that others had written off as dying was full of entrepreneurs who refused to give up, who just needed someone to show them how to cut the right costs and keep the right people. I thought about the empty chair at that table 1 year ago, the space where I was supposed to sit but wasn't welcome. At the time, it had felt like erasure, like being written out of my own life story. Now I understood it differently. That empty chair hadn't been an absence. It had been an opening. A space to step away from a table where I was never truly welcome, to build my own table where everyone had a seat. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. She'd attached a photo from her business ethics class where she was teaching a case study about recognizing fraud in personal relationships. Using our story to help others, she wrote. Hope that's okay. I smiled, typing back, our story belongs to you too. Teach them well. Outside, Chicago was waking up. Somewhere in Naperville, Serafina, or Sarah as she called herself now, was probably preparing for another day of answering phones and scheduling appointments. Somewhere in Milwaukee, Alexander was living in his childhood bedroom, trying to rebuild from nothing. And here in Lincoln Park, I was planning the next phase of a business built on the principle that everyone deserved a chance at redemption, except those who refused to acknowledge they needed it. The housekeeper badge had been meant to put me in my place. It succeeded, just not in the way they intended. My place wasn't at their table, begging for acceptance that would never come. My place was here, building something meaningful, surrounded by people who saw my worth without needing a name badge to confirm it. The badge had labeled me as staff. In the end, I'd staffed an entirely new life, one where respect wasn't negotiable and dignity wasn't determined by bloodlines or bank accounts. The sun climbed higher, warming the penthouse with golden light. Another day was beginning, full of struggling businesses to save and families to preserve. The work that Alexander had called my little project had become Chicago's premier restructuring firm. The woman they'd labeled the housekeeper had cleaned house indeed, sweeping away everything that no longer served and building something better in its place. If this story of calculated revenge left you speechless, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Victoria placed her wedding ring on that empty table, turning their public humiliation into her Declaration of Independence. What was your favorite moment of justice? Drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell to catch more gripping stories of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate triumph. My husband left me in the rain, 37 miles from home. He said I needed a lesson. I didn't argue. I just watched him drive away. A black truck pulled up moments later. My bodyguard stepped out, calm and ready. I smiled as I climbed in. His cruelty had ended. This was his last mistake. I pressed record on my phone and slipped it back into my pocket as Andrew's Mercedes pulled into the empty rest stop. The rain hadn't started yet, but I could smell it coming. Get out, he said, not even turning off the engine. You need a lesson, Amanda. Walking home might teach you some respect. 37 miles. He'd calculated it perfectly. Too far for an Uber, too remote for public transport. What he didn't know was that I'd been recording everything for 8 months, and Marcus was already parked behind the abandoned gas station, waiting for my signal. The leather seat creaked as I turned to face him. Andrew's jaw was set in that familiar line of satisfaction, the one he wore when closing a particularly ruthless deal at his hedge fund. 3 hours ago, we'd been sitting in Morton's Steakhouse celebrating our anniversary. Now he was abandoning me on a remote stretch of highway because I'd asked why $10,000 had disappeared from our joint account. You're seriously doing this? I kept my voice steady, letting the phone capture every word. Actions have consequences, Amanda. You went behind my back, called my accountant, embarrassed me with your paranoid questions. Maybe a long walk in the rain will remind you who manages the money in this family. I thought about the pearl earring in my jewelry box at home. Nadine's earring found under our bed 2 days ago. The $10,000 had probably bought her something pretty. But I didn't mention it. Not yet. Everything had to happen in the right order, just as Marcus and I had rehearsed. It's going to storm, I said, gesturing at the darkening sky. Then you'd better start walking. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel. Unless you want to apologize right now and admit you were wrong. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here with me today. If you believe that no one deserves to be abandoned in a storm, literal or metaphorical, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps these important stories reach those who need them most. 6 months ago I would have apologized. 6 months ago I still believed the marriage could be saved. That was before I'd found the second set of books for his company, before the mysterious withdrawals, before discovering he'd been slowly transferring our assets into accounts only he controlled. The moment I'd started asking questions, he turned vicious. Tonight was his escalation, but it was also his mistake. I'll walk, I said, opening the door. Smart choice. Maybe by the time you get home you'll remember your place. I stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. The rest stop had been abandoned for years, just a dark building with boarded windows and a parking lot being reclaimed by weeds. Andrew had chosen it specifically for its isolation. He'd mentioned it last week casually while we were driving past. Imagine being stranded here, he'd said. Miles from anywhere. That's when I knew what he was planning. The Mercedes engine revved. Through the passenger window I could see him checking his phone, probably texting Nadine that the deed was done. Then he pulled away, tires squealing slightly on the worn pavement, leaving me standing alone in the gathering darkness. I counted to 60, watching his taillights disappear around the bend. Then I walked calmly toward the abandoned gas station where Marcus's black Ford was hidden. My brother stepped out, holding an umbrella and a thermos of coffee. Did you get everything? He asked. Every word. I pulled out my phone, stopping the recording. He actually said I need to remember my place. Marcus shook his head. 3 years of watching him control you was bad enough. But this. He gestured at the empty rest stop. This is criminal abandonment. Rebecca's going to have a field day with this recording. I accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. The rain was starting now, fat drops hitting the cracked concrete. By morning, Andrew would think I'd spent the night walking through a storm, broken and humiliated. He'd expect to find me huddled on our doorstep, ready to beg forgiveness. Valentina's ready? I asked. She's been monitoring the accounts all evening. The moment he transferred that $10,000 this afternoon, she documented everything. The forensic audit goes back 2 years. He's been bleeding money into offshore accounts, probably planning to divorce you once he'd hidden enough. And Rebecca? Filing the emergency papers at 9 tomorrow morning. Abandonment, financial abuse, fraud. She says with tonight's recording plus everything else we've gathered, he won't know what hit him. We climbed into Marcus's truck just as the sky opened up, rain hammering against the windshield. I thought about Andrew driving home, satisfied with his cruel lesson, maybe pouring himself a scotch to celebrate putting his wife in her place. He had no idea that 8 months ago when he'd first started hiding money, I'd hired my own team. Marcus had installed cameras throughout our house under the guise of security upgrades. Valentina, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial abuse cases, had been tracking every penny. Rebecca, one of the city's most ruthless divorce attorneys, had been building a case file that now filled 3 boxes. The house recordings uploaded successfully, Marcus said, checking his phone. We've got him on camera last Tuesday bringing Nadine there while you were at your mother's. They used your bed. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not heartbreak, that had passed months ago. This was resolve, hard and crystalline. He's been planning this for a while, I said. The escalation, the financial control, the isolation from friends. Classic abuse patterns. Rebecca says judges don't look kindly on husbands who abandon their wives as punishment. Marcus drove carefully through the storm, taking back roads to avoid any possibility of Andrew seeing us. We'd planned this route weeks ago, even doing practice runs. Every detail mattered. The hotel room was booked under my maiden name, paid for with cash Marcus had withdrawn gradually over 2 months. The clothes I'd need were already there, along with copies of all the documentation. "You know he'll come looking for you when you don't show up tonight," Marcus said. "Let him. The hotel security cameras will show me checking in alone, soaking wet, traumatized. The front desk clerk will testify that I could barely speak through the tears." Rebecca coached me on exactly what to say and how to act. The rain grew heavier as we drove toward the city. Andrew would be home by now, probably on his second drink, maybe calling Nadine to brag about teaching me a lesson. Tomorrow morning he'd wake up expecting to find me broken. Instead, he'd find his assets frozen, his office locked, and federal investigators waiting to discuss the discrepancies Valentina had uncovered in his hedge fund's books. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked as the hotel came into view. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, independent and successful before Andrew had systematically dismantled my life. I thought about the recording on my phone, his cold voice telling me to get out and walk 37 miles in a storm. I thought about Nadine's earring and the empty bank accounts and the prenup he'd hidden in his office that would have left me with nothing. "I've been ready for 8 months, I said. He just gave me the final piece of evidence I needed. Marcus pulled up to the hotel's side entrance. I grabbed the small bag we'd prepared, just enough to look like I'd escaped with nothing, and stepped out into the rain. It was time to play the part of the traumatized wife, abandoned and afraid. Tomorrow Andrew would learn who really needed a lesson. The hotel lobby felt impossibly bright after the darkness outside. Water dripped from my hair onto the marble floor as I approached the front desk, my hands shaking just enough to be convincing. The night clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, immediately reached for a stack of towels. "Oh my goodness, are you all right?" She rushed around the counter, wrapping a towel around my shoulders. "My husband," I managed, letting my voice crack. "He left me at a rest stop. In the storm. I had to walk for miles before someone helped me." Her face shifted from concern to horror. "Perfect. Every word would be documented in the hotel's incident report, just as Rebecca had instructed." The clerk guided me to a chair and brought me hot tea while processing my check-in. I gave her my maiden name, Amanda Harrison, and paid with the emergency credit card I'd opened 6 months ago, the one Andrew knew nothing about. Room 412 was small but clean, overlooking the city lights blurred by rain. I locked the door, put the chain on, and finally allowed myself to breathe. Then I pulled out my second phone, the one Marcus had given me, and played back the recording from the car. Andrew's voice filled the room, cold and measured. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Calling my accountant behind my back. Asking questions about our finances like you'd understand the answers." My own voice, carefully controlled. "It's our money, Andrew. I have a right to know where it's going. Our money." His laugh was sharp. "I earn it. I manage it. You spend it on overpriced groceries and those ridiculous charity luncheons. $70 for organic vegetables last week, Amanda. $70. I remembered that shopping trip. I'd bought ingredients for the dinner party he'd insisted on hosting for his clients. The same dinner where he'd spent $800 on wine without blinking." The recording continued. "You embarrassed me at the Morrisons' party, contradicting me about the European markets in front of my colleagues. Where did you even get those opinions? Some morning talk show." "I have an MBA from Northwestern, Andrew. I worked in financial services for 5 years before we met." "Before I rescued you from that mediocre career, you mean? You were analyzing penny stocks at a third-tier firm. I gave you a life you never could have achieved on your own." I closed my eyes, remembering the woman I'd been at Henderson Investments. I hadn't been analyzing penny stocks. I'd been managing a portfolio worth $30 million. But Andrew had rewritten history so many times, sometimes even I forgot the truth. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Valentina found something. 3 more accounts in the Caymans. He's been moving money for 18 months. 18 months. I thought back to when things had started changing. The sudden interest in separate checking accounts, for tax purposes. The financial advisor who appeared without explanation. The documents he'd asked me to sign without reading because, it's just routine stuff, trust me." Another text, this one from Rebecca. "Judge Coleman agreed to emergency hearing tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring the recording." Judge Patricia Coleman had a reputation for seeing through men like Andrew. She'd presided over 3 high-profile financial abuse cases in the past year, all resulting in favorable outcomes for the wives. Rebecca had specifically waited for her rotation. I changed into the dry clothes from the emergency bag I'd hidden here yesterday, then sat at the small desk and began writing. Not the statement Rebecca would help me polish for court, but notes for myself, reminders of who I really was beneath the person Andrew had tried to create. I wrote about the promotion I'd turned down because Andrew said the travel would strain our marriage. The investment opportunity I'd identified that would have tripled my personal savings, if I'd still had personal savings. The friendship with my college roommate that ended when Andrew convinced me she was jealous of our happiness. My phone rang. Andrew's ringtone. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message on speaker, recording it with my second phone. Amanda, this is ridiculous. It's been 3 hours. The lesson's been learned, okay? Call me back and I'll come get you. Don't make this worse than it needs to be. 10 minutes later, another call. This time his voice was harder. I know you have your phone. Stop being childish and call me back. If you're trying to worry me, it's not working. I'm going to bed. You can find your own way home. But I could hear the edge creeping in. He was starting to realize something was off. I'd always called by now, always apologized, always came crawling back. The silence was breaking his script. At midnight, Nadine called. I almost didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer, staying silent. Hello? Amanda. Her voice was uncertain. Andrew asked me to call you. He's worried. He said you two had a fight and you're not answering his calls. He wants you to know he's sorry and you should come home. Andrew never apologized. Never admitted fault. That he'd sent his mistress to deliver a fake apology showed how off balance he was. I hung up without speaking. By 1 a.m, the calls were coming every 15 minutes. Andrew, his mother Margaret, even his business partner James. I documented every single one, their numbers, their times, their increasingly frantic messages. The abandoned wife was supposed to be desperate for rescue, not maintaining radio silence. I ordered room service, charging it to the card. Soup and salad and a glass of wine. Let the receipt show I was composed enough to eat. Let it document that I wasn't falling apart the way Andrew expected. At 2:30 a text came through that made me smile. Not from Andrew but from our neighbor Mrs. Chin. Saw Andrew in his driveway with a flashlight looking under your car. Then he drove off fast. Is everything okay? He was looking for my car, not knowing Marcus had moved it to a long-term parking garage across town 2 days ago. Another piece of evidence that I'd been planning to leave, that his abandonment had simply accelerated my timeline. I pulled the curtains aside and watched the storm rage over the city. Somewhere out there, Andrew was beginning to realize his perfectly controlled world was slipping. He thought he taught me a lesson about power and place. Tomorrow, when the markets opened and he discovered his offshore accounts frozen, when his key card failed at the office, when federal investigators appeared with questions about discrepancies Valentina had uncovered, he'd understand who'd really been teaching whom. The rain hammered against the window like it was trying to break through. 8 months of planning, of documenting, of pretending to be the subdued wife while building a case that would destroy him. All leading to this moment, this perfect storm of his own making. I set my alarm for 7, knowing I'd need to look appropriately distraught for the emergency hearing. Rebecca would meet me at noon to prepare. But for now, for these few hours, I sat in the darkness and felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Freedom. The morning sun cut through the hotel curtains at 7 sharp, but I'd been awake since 5, sitting at the small desk with my laptop open to our joint checking account. The balance showed exactly what I expected. Andrew had already moved another $20,000 out at 6:47 a.m. He was panicking, trying to hide assets before I could get to them. Too late. Valentina had already documented everything. By noon, my hotel suite had transformed into a command center. Valentina arrived first, wheeling in 2 suitcases full of printed documents, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged from working through the night. She spread everything across the dining table methodically: bank statements, wire transfer records, falsified tax documents, each stack labeled with color-coded tabs. The Cayman accounts are frozen as of 9 this morning, she said, pulling up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Andrew tried to access them at dawn. 3 failed attempts. He's probably destroying his office right now. Rebecca walked in next, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in rapid legal terms I only half understood. She ended the call and turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. Judge Coleman moved our hearing to 1 o'clock. She wants to address this immediately. Also, Andrew hired Richard Blackwood. The shark? Marcus asked, entering with a box of surveillance equipment. The same one who got that pharmaceutical executive off last year. Blackwood doesn't come cheap. Andrew must have liquidated something significant to afford him. I felt a flutter of concern, but Rebecca placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Blackwood's good, but he can't argue with video evidence and financial records. Plus he's walking into this cold. We've had 8 months to prepare. Marcus connected his laptop to the suite's television and pulled up the surveillance footage from our home. I've compiled the highlights, if you can call them that. Fair warning, Amanda, this isn't easy to watch. The first clip showed Andrew in his study at 2 a.m. 3 weeks ago. I'd been asleep upstairs, knocked out by the sleeping pills he'd started suggesting I take for my anxiety. On screen, Andrew carefully photographed documents from our safe, then placed them back exactly as they were. The documents were our joint investment portfolios, my mother's power of attorney forms, and the deed to the lake house my grandmother had left me. He's been building a duplicate file, Valentina explained, creating forgeries with subtle changes. If you hadn't caught this, he could have slowly replaced the originals. The next clip was worse. Andrew and Nadine in our living room 2 months ago when he told me he was at a client dinner. She was wearing my robe, the silk one from our honeymoon in Paris. They were laughing about something on his phone. Turn the volume up, I said, though my stomach churned. Andrew's voice filled the room. She actually believed me when I said the conference was mandatory. I've trained her well. A few more months and I'll have everything transferred. Then we can stop this charade. Nadine's giggle was like nails on glass. The prenup really says she gets nothing? The prenup's irrelevant. She'll never fight it. Amanda doesn't have the spine. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be in Costa Rica, and she'll be too broken to do anything about it. Marcus paused the video. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I stood up, walked to the window and stared at the city below. Somewhere out there, Andrew was probably in his office trying to figure out why his computer access was revoked, why his assistant couldn't reach the bank, why everything was falling apart. There's more, Marcus said quietly. Do you want to see it? I nodded. The next clip showed Andrew on the phone in our garage, pacing between our cars. The timestamp showed last Tuesday when I'd been at my book club. Jennifer's been perfect, he was saying. She has no idea I'm recording our conversations. Every detail about Amanda's mother's estate, the Alzheimer's diagnosis they're hiding, the trust fund from their father. It's worth nearly $2 million and Amanda doesn't even know it exists. My legs felt weak. Jennifer, my younger sister who I'd been protecting from her gambling addiction for years, who I'd covered for with our parents countless times. She'd been feeding Andrew information about our family, about money I didn't even know existed. When did he contact her? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Valentina pulled up phone records. First contact was 13 months ago. Regular calls started 10 months ago. Always when you weren't home. He's been paying her debts in exchange for information. Rebecca checked her watch. We need to leave for court in 30 minutes. Amanda, are you ready for this? Seeing him today. I turned from the window. Show me the rest first. I need to know everything. Marcus clicked to another folder. These are from his office computer. I had a contact in IT pull them before Andrew's access was cut this morning. The screen filled with emails between Andrew and his attorney, dated 6 months ago. The subject line read, Project Fresh Start. Inside were detailed plans for divorcing me, including psychological tactics to make me doubt myself, financial moves to leave me destitute, and even suggestions for gradually increasing emotional abuse to make me more compliant during proceedings. One line stood out. The key is to make her believe she's going crazy. Gaslight consistently. Hide things, deny conversations, contradict her memories. By the time we file, she'll be too unstable to fight effectively. I thought about all the times over the past year when Andrew had told me I was misremembering things. The dinner reservation I'd made that he swore I'd never told him about. The conversation about visiting my parents that he claimed never happened. The jewelry that went missing, then reappeared in strange places. I'd started writing things down secretly, thinking I was losing my mind. He was following a playbook, Rebecca said. This attorney, Douglas Stern, specializes in high-net-worth divorces where one spouse wants to leave the other with nothing. He's currently under investigation by the bar for ethics violations. Valentina pulled up one final document. This is what triggered our emergency filing this morning. Andrew transferred $3.2 million from his hedge fund's client accounts into a personal account in Panama yesterday afternoon. Right before he abandoned you. He must have thought he'd have more time before anyone noticed. He was running, I said, understanding flooding through me. The abandonment wasn't just about control. He knew something was closing in. The SEC received an anonymous tip yesterday morning, Rebecca said with a slight smile, about irregularities in his fund's reporting. I looked at her. Valentina actually. Once she documented the embezzlement, we had an obligation to report it. The weight of Andrew's crimes was staggering. This wasn't just about our marriage or his affair. He was a criminal who'd been using me as cover while he pillaged client accounts and prepared his escape. The man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years was capable of destroying not just me, but dozens of innocent investors who'd trusted him with their retirement savings. Judge Coleman needs to see all of this, I said, gathering my strength. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence. Rebecca smiled, the kind of smile that reminded me why she'd never lost a financial abuse case. She'll see it all. And then Andrew Mitchell is going to learn what it feels like to lose everything. The courthouse corridors were marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate. I walked through them in my sharpest suit, the navy one Andrew had never seen because I'd bought it last month specifically for this moment. Rebecca walked beside me, briefcase in hand, while Marcus flanked my other side. We entered courtroom 4B at exactly 12:55 p.m. Andrew was already there, seated beside Richard Blackwood, whose $1,000 haircut couldn't hide the stress lines around his eyes. Andrew looked smaller somehow, his usual commanding presence diminished by wrinkled clothes and shadows under his eyes. He'd clearly slept in his office. When he saw me, his expression shifted from exhaustion to pure rage. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Patricia Coleman entered, her black robes adding gravity to an already tense atmosphere. She took her seat and immediately began reviewing the documents before her, reading glasses perched on her nose. "We're here for an emergency petition filed by Amanda Mitchell regarding marital assets and spousal abandonment," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen every type of marital disaster. "Mr. Blackwood, I see you've just been retained this morning." "Yes, Your Honor. We request a continuance to properly review." "Denied. Your client allegedly abandoned his wife in dangerous conditions last night. Time is of the essence." He turned to Rebecca. "Counselor, present your evidence." Rebecca stood, smooth as silk. "Your Honor, at approximately 8:47 p.m. yesterday, Andrew Mitchell deliberately abandoned his wife at a rest stop 37 miles from their home during a severe storm. We have audio recording of the incident." She played the recording through the courtroom speakers. Andrew's voice filled the space, cold and clear. "You need a lesson, Amanda. Walking home might teach you some respect." I watched Andrew's face go white. Blackwood leaned over, whispering furiously. Andrew shook his head, gesturing wildly with his hands. "Furthermore," Rebecca continued, "Mr. Mitchell has been systematically hiding marital assets for 18 months. We have documentation of offshore accounts totaling $8 million, and evidence of embezzlement from his hedge fund totaling $3.2 million. Objection. Blackwood stood. "These are unsubstantiated allegations." "Then let's substantiate them," Rebecca said calmly, producing a stack of bank documents. "Exhibit A through F, Your Honor. Wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, all initiated by Mr. Mitchell without his wife's knowledge or consent." Judge Coleman reviewed the documents, her expression growing darker with each page. "Mr. Mitchell, did you abandon your wife last night?" Andrew stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, there was a misunderstanding. My wife and I had an argument." "It's a yes or no question, Mr. Mitchell." I left her at a rest stop, but during a storm? 37 miles from home. She had her phone. She could have called someone." The judge's eyebrows rose. "How considerate of you." She turned back to Rebecca. "Continue." Rebecca pulled up financial records on the courtroom screen. Mr. Mitchell has also been conducting an extramarital affair with his assistant, Nadine Rodriguez, using marital funds to purchase gifts and fund trips. This includes a pearl necklace valued at $12,000, reported as stolen to insurance but actually given to Ms. Rodriguez. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. He's here. The courtroom doors opened and Tom Chin from the SEC walked in, followed by 2 federal agents. Andrew's head whipped around and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Your Honor, Tom Chin addressed the judge. I apologize for the interruption. We have a warrant for Andrew Mitchell's arrest on charges of wire fraud and embezzlement. Blackwood jumped up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. So is stealing $3.2 million from client accounts, Judge Coleman responded dryly. She looked at the federal agents. Gentlemen, please wait until we conclude this hearing. Mr. Mitchell isn't going anywhere. Andrew sank into his chair. His phone, sitting on the defendant's table, lit up with call after call. I could see the names flashing. His mother, his business partner James, and repeatedly Nadine. Given the evidence presented, Judge Coleman continued, I'm granting the emergency injunction. All marital assets are frozen pending investigation. Mrs. Mitchell is awarded exclusive use of the marital home and temporary support of $10,000 per month. Mr. Mitchell, you are ordered to stay 500 feet away from your wife. $10,000 a month? Andrew exploded, standing despite Blackwood's attempt to pull him down. That's insane. She doesn't need. Mr. Mitchell, you abandoned your wife in a storm after hiding millions in assets. I'm being generous, not holding you in contempt right now. Sit down. As Andrew collapsed back into his chair, my phone rang. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen. I declined the call, but she immediately called again. And again. Rebecca leaned over. You should document those. I nodded, screenshotting the call log. 17 calls from Jennifer in the past hour. 43 from Andrew since last night. 22 from his mother Margaret. Even a few from numbers I didn't recognize. Probably Andrew's colleagues or clients who'd heard about the federal investigation. Tom Chin approached our table while the judge finalized her orders. Mrs. Mitchell, we'll need your cooperation with our investigation. Your attorney mentioned you have additional evidence. I nodded. 8 months of documentation. Financial records, recordings, emails. Everything. Good. Your husband's looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted on all charges. Andrew must have heard him because he suddenly stood again, pointing at me. You did this. You set me up. This whole thing was a trap. Judge Coleman's gavel came down hard. Mr. Mitchell, control yourself or I'll add contempt charges. She's been planning this. Andrew continued, his composure completely shattered. The recording, the documentation, she knew I was going to leave her there. So you admit to abandoning her? The judge asked. Blackwood physically pulled Andrew back down, but the damage was done. Andrew had just confessed in open court in front of federal agents to deliberately abandoning me. As we prepared to leave, Nadine burst through the courtroom doors. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her carefully styled hair disheveled. She looked around wildly until her eyes landed on Andrew. You said you were divorced, she screamed across the courtroom. You said the papers were already filed. You said she was crazy and making things up. The judge sighed. Ma'am, please remove yourself from my courtroom. But Nadine wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, waving it in the air. I have texts. Recordings. He promised me we were getting married. He said the money was his. Tom Chen's eyes lit up. He approached Nadine carefully. Ma'am, we'd very much like to speak with you. Andrew's destruction was complete. His mistress was turning state's evidence, his assets were frozen, federal agents were waiting to arrest him, and his carefully constructed image had crumbled in less than an hour. As we walked out, leaving Andrew to be processed by federal agents, my phone buzzed with one final message. It was from Margaret, Andrew's mother. I hope you're satisfied, destroying a good man over petty jealousy. I deleted it without responding. Margaret would learn soon enough that her son wasn't a good man. He was a criminal who'd been exposed, and I wasn't the one who'd destroyed him. He'd destroyed himself. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when we emerged. Someone had leaked the story. Probably a court clerk who recognized Andrew's name from the financial pages. Microphones thrust toward us as Rebecca guided me through the crowd, her hand firm on my elbow. Mrs. Mitchell, is it true your husband stole millions? Amanda, how long have you been planning this? Will you be pressing additional charges? Rebecca stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. My client will not be making any statements at this time. The federal investigation is ongoing. We pushed through to Marcus's truck and I caught a glimpse of the evening news van setting up across the street. By tonight, Andrew's face would be on every local channel. The golden boy of Minneapolis hedge funds, arrested for embezzlement and fraud. Margaret must be dying inside. Back at the hotel, I collapsed onto the couch while Rebecca poured us both water. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since we'd left court. I scrolled through the messages, each one a different flavor of shock or judgment. A text from my hairdresser, just saw the news. Good for you, honey. From Andrew's golf buddy Richard, this is all a misunderstanding, right? Andrew would never do what they're saying. From 3 different neighbors, variations of, we always knew something was off about him. The most interesting message came from James Morrison, Andrew's business partner. Amanda, we need to talk. There are things about the fund you should know. Things that weren't in the federal filing. Rebecca read it over my shoulder. Set up a meeting. Record everything. At 4 o'clock, the local news broke the story. The headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Prominent hedge fund manager arrested for embezzlement following spousal abandonment incident. They'd gotten Andrew's mugshot already. He looked haggard, his usual perfectly styled hair disheveled, his designer suit replaced with standard-issue jail clothing. The reporter stood outside our house. My house now, describing the scandal in breathless detail. Sources close to the investigation report that Andrew Mitchell allegedly abandoned his wife during last night's severe storm, leaving her stranded 37 miles from home. This morning, federal agents arrested Mitchell on charges of embezzling $3.2 million from client accounts. His wife, Amanda Mitchell, could not be reached for comment. My phone rang. Jennifer again. This time I answered. Amanda, please, I need to explain. You told him about Mom's will. About the trust fund Dad set up. About her diagnosis. Silence. Then quietly, he said he was trying to help. He said you were too stressed to handle the information, that he wanted to protect you. He paid your gambling debts. I didn't know what he was planning. Thought he loved you. He seemed so concerned, so caring. He said you were fragile, that you needed guidance. I thought about all the times Jennifer had called over the past year, asking seemingly innocent questions. How's Mom doing? Have you talked to her lawyer lately? Remember that property Dad bought in Wisconsin? Each conversation had been intelligence gathering for Andrew. He played you, I said. Just like he played me. Amanda, I'm so sorry. When I saw the news, when I realized what he'd done, I've been sick all day. Can we meet? Please. Rebecca shook her head, but something in Jennifer's voice made me pause. She sounded genuinely broken, not just worried about consequences. Tomorrow. Neutral location. You come alone. After I hung up, Marcus pulled up social media on his laptop. You need to see this. Andrew's company Facebook page was imploding. Clients were posting demands for their money back. Former employees were sharing stories of suspicious activities they'd witnessed. One woman wrote, "He fired me when I questioned missing funds last year. Now I know why." But the most devastating blow came from Nadine. She'd gone nuclear on Instagram, posting screenshots of their text conversations, photos from their trips funded with stolen money, and a long caption detailing how Andrew had manipulated her into believing I was the villain. He told me his wife was emotionally disturbed, she wrote. That she refused to grant him a divorce. That she threatened to ruin him if he left. I believed every word because he was so convincing, so sophisticated. I was an idiot, but he was a master manipulator. The photos were damaging. Andrew and Nadine in first-class seats to Paris, champagne glasses raised. Andrew and Nadine at the exact resort in Mexico where we'd celebrated our 5th anniversary. Andrew and Nadine in our bed. She'd actually posted that one, though Instagram quickly removed it. By 6 o'clock, Andrew's mother Margaret had released a statement through her lawyer. Rebecca read it aloud, barely containing her laughter. The Mitchell family is shocked by these allegations. We believe this is a coordinated attack orchestrated by a vindictive spouse seeking financial gain. Andrew Mitchell is an upstanding member of the community who has been victimized by a calculating woman who married him for his money. She's really going with that angle? Marcus asked. After what everyone heard her say in court? My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. Against Rebecca's advice, I answered. Mrs. Mitchell? This is Patricia Huang from the Wall Street Journal. We're running a story about systematic fraud in boutique hedge funds. Your husband's case is part of a larger pattern we've been investigating. Would you be willing to share your experience? Rebecca took the phone. This is Amanda Mitchell's attorney. All press inquiries should be directed to my office. She hung up and turned to me. By tomorrow this will be national news. Andrew didn't just destroy himself, he's taking down an entire network of corrupt fund managers. The FBI is expanding their investigation. I walked to the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere in Federal Holding, Andrew was probably meeting with Blackwood trying to figure out how to spin this. But there was no spinning video evidence, recorded confessions and millions in stolen money. My phone lit up with one more message, this one from David Brennan, Andrew's biggest client. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that several of us victims are pursuing civil suits against your husband. However, we want to be clear. You are not our target. We know you were a victim too. In fact, we'd like you to testify about what you observed. The irony was perfect. Andrew had spent years telling me I was too stupid to understand finance, too naive to grasp business. Now his former clients wanted my testimony to help bury him. As the sun set over Minneapolis, painting the sky the color of justice, I realized that Andrew's public downfall was just beginning. Tomorrow there would be more headlines, more revelations, more people coming forward with stories about the man they trusted with their money. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I sat in peaceful silence, no longer afraid of his footsteps, his moods, his cruel words designed to keep me small. The man who'd abandoned me in the rain had created his own storm, and now he was drowning in it. The next morning brought a knock at my hotel door that I wasn't expecting. Through the peephole, I saw Jennifer standing in the hallway, her usually perfect appearance completely undone. Her hands shook as she clutched a manila envelope to her chest, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. I thought we agreed to meet at a neutral location. I couldn't wait. Amanda, please. There are things you need to know right now. Before the FBI talks to me this afternoon. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the adjoining room, alert and protective. I nodded to him that it was okay, then let Jennifer inside. She sat on the edge of the couch, placing the envelope on the coffee table with trembling fingers. Andrew first contacted me 13 months ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He knew about the gambling. I don't know how he found out, but he knew I owed $47,000 to some very unforgiving people. He offered to pay it all, no questions asked, if I just answered some questions about our family finances. And you agreed. My voice was flat, controlled. I was desperate. They were threatening to go to my employer to ruin my career. Andrew seemed like he genuinely wanted to help. He said you were too proud to ask our parents for money, that he wanted to surprise you by solving family problems behind the scenes. She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of printed emails. These are our conversations. Every one of them. I printed them all last night when I realized what he'd really been doing. I picked up the first email, dated over a year ago. Andrew's tone was warm, concerned, brotherly even. He wrote about wanting to be a better husband, wanting to understand my family dynamics so he could support me better. The manipulation was masterful. He was particularly interested in Mom, Jennifer continued. He wanted to know about her health, her mental state, her finances. I thought he was planning something nice for her, maybe paying for better care. You told him about the Alzheimer's. Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face. She made me promise not to tell you. She didn't want you to worry, said you had enough stress with Andrew being so demanding. But he was so persistent, so caring. He said he'd noticed signs and wanted to help. I kept reading. The emails showed Andrew's questions growing more specific over time. What properties did our parents own? Were there any trusts? Who was the executor of their wills? Jennifer had answered everything, believing she was helping her brother-in-law better care for our family. Last month he asked me to get Mom to sign some papers, Jennifer said. He said they were for insurance purposes, that it would protect her assets if her condition worsened. I actually took them to her, Amanda. Thank God her lawyer was there that day and recognized them as property transfer documents. That's when I started to realize something was wrong. My phone buzzed. David Brennan was calling. I put him on speaker so Marcus could hear. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sorry to bother you, but this is urgent. I've been going through our client files all night. Andrew wasn't just stealing from the general fund. He specifically targeted our elderly clients, particularly widows. What do you mean, targeted? Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, for instance. Her husband died 2 years ago, left her everything with specific instructions that Andrew personally manage her portfolio. Within 6 months, Andrew had convinced her to sign power of attorney documents. She thought she was giving him authority to make trades. He used it to drain her accounts. I felt sick. Eleanor Hartley was 78 years old. I'd met her at several company events, a sweet woman who always talked about her grandchildren. How much did he take from her? $800,000. But here's the worst part. He convinced her she was developing memory problems, that she was forgetting conversations about withdrawals she'd authorized. He gaslit an elderly woman into believing she had dementia. Marcus was already taking notes, documenting everything for Rebecca. This changed the entire scope of the case. Andrew wasn't just a white-collar criminal. He was a predator who specifically hunted vulnerable people. I have recordings, David continued. I started secretly recording our partnership meetings 2 years ago when I noticed discrepancies. I was building a case to take to the authorities, but I was scared. Andrew had connections everywhere. But now that he's already in custody, I want to provide everything I have. After David hung up, Jennifer pulled out one more document from her envelope. There's something else. About Dad's estate. Our father had died 5 years ago, leaving what we thought was a modest inheritance split between Jennifer and me. But the paper she handed me showed something different. A trust account in my name alone, established the year before he died. He knew about my gambling even then, Jennifer said quietly. He loved me, but he didn't trust me with money. So he set this up for you with Mom as the trustee. It's worth about $2 million. Andrew found out about it through me, and he's been trying to access it for months. I stared at the document. $2 million my father had hidden to protect it from both Jennifer's addiction and, unknowingly, from my husband's greed. The account was held at a small private bank in Wisconsin, one Andrew wouldn't have known about without Jennifer's information. We need to go see Mom, Jennifer said. Today. She's been holding on to something for you, something she wouldn't even tell me about. She said she was waiting for the right moment. An hour later, we sat in my mother's room at the memory care facility. She was having one of her increasingly rare clear days, her eyes bright and focused as she held my hand. I knew what he was the first time I met him, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. The way he looked at our house, evaluating everything like he was cataloging assets. The way he steered conversations toward money. Your father saw it too. She reached into her bedside drawer and pulled out a small key. Safety deposit box. First National Bank on Hennepin. Your father put things there the week before he died. Documents. Evidence. Evidence of what, Mom? Andrew tried to forge your signature last year. Loan documents, property transfers. The bank manager was your father's friend. He called me, sent me copies of everything. It's all in the box. I took the key, feeling its weight. My father had been protecting me even from beyond the grave, and my mother had been standing guard over that protection despite her declining memory. There's more, Mom said, her grip tightening on my hand. The FBI came here yesterday. Not about Andrew's arrest, about something bigger. They said his name came up in an investigation that's been running for 3 years. A network of fund managers who've been systematically defrauding elderly clients across 5 states. The room felt suddenly airless. Andrew's abandonment of me in the rain wasn't just about control or cruelty. He'd known the FBI was closing in. He'd wanted me broken and compliant because he thought he could use me as either a shield or a scapegoat when everything collapsed. He never expected you to fight back, my mother said, a small smile crossing her face. Men like him never do. They think kindness is weakness. They're always surprised when they learn otherwise. As we prepared to leave, my mother squeezed my hand one more time. Your father would be proud of you. You're stronger than Andrew ever imagined. Driving away from the facility, Jennifer beside me and Marcus following in his truck, I thought about the layers of deception Andrew had built. Each revelation peeled back another level of his criminality. He wasn't just a bad husband or a corrupt fund manager. He was the center of a web of financial abuse that had destroyed dozens of lives. But he'd made one fatal error. He'd assumed that the woman he'd left in the rain would stay there, broken and defeated. Instead, she'd become the storm that would wash away everything he'd built on the suffering of others. The First National Bank on Hennepin stood like a fortress of old money and older secrets. Jennifer waited in the car while Marcus accompanied me inside, where the safety deposit box my mother had protected waited in a climate-controlled vault. The bank manager, Mr. Paulson, remembered my father well and handled the key with the reverence of someone who understood he was part of something significant. Inside the box lay a stack of documents that made my hands tremble. Forged loan applications with my signature, dated 6 months ago. Property transfer papers for my grandmother's lake house, which Andrew had apparently tried to sell without my knowledge. Bank statements from accounts I'd never seen, opened in my name but controlled by Andrew. My father had somehow obtained copies of everything, his handwriting on sticky notes explaining what each document meant. One note, attached to a forged power of attorney document, simply read, "He will try to take everything. Don't let him." Marcus photographed every page while I sat in stunned silence. The scope of Andrew's betrayal kept expanding, like ink spreading through water. This wasn't just about our marriage or even the stolen millions. He'd been systematically working to erase my financial existence, to make me completely dependent on him or worse, to frame me for his crimes if necessary. 4 months later, I walked into the federal courthouse for the first day of Andrew's criminal trial. The media attention had only intensified since his arrest. News vans lined the street. Reporters called out questions I didn't answer. I wore a charcoal gray suit that had never seen the inside of our shared closet, bought specifically for this moment. Professional, dignified, expensive enough to show I wasn't broken. Andrew sat at the defendant's table in a suit that no longer fit properly. He'd lost weight in federal custody, and his formerly perfect hair had grown out awkwardly. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I smiled, the same serene smile I used to give him over morning coffee when he'd lecture me about my spending. But now that smile carried the weight of everything I knew and everything he was about to lose. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, laid out the case methodically. 12 counts of wire fraud. 2 counts of elder abuse. 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Doctored books, hidden accounts, forged documents, recorded conversations where Andrew explicitly discussed stealing from clients. For 11 days, witness after witness took the stand. Elderly clients described how Andrew had convinced them to sign documents they didn't understand. Former employees testified about being ordered to falsify records. The forensic accountant walked the jury through the labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies Andrew had created. On day 12, the courtroom doors opened and Nadine Rodriguez walked in. She looked nothing like the polished young woman who'd worn my grandmother's pearls. Her designer clothes had been replaced with a conservative dress, her elaborate hairstyle with a simple bun. She'd been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, and she was about to bury Andrew with it. "Ms. Rodriguez," the prosecutor began, "how long were you romantically involved with the defendant?" 18 months, Nadine answered, her voice steady but quiet. "And during that time, did Mr. Mitchell ever discuss his business practices with you?" "Yes. Frequently. He thought it was amusing to explain how he was moving money around without anyone noticing. He called it playing three-dimensional chess while everyone else played checkers." She produced recordings from her phone, conversations where Andrew bragged about targeting elderly clients, about hiding money from me, about his plans to disappear to Costa Rica once he'd accumulated enough. In one recording, his voice clear and damning, he said, "Amanda's the perfect cover. Sweet, trusting, asks no questions. By the time she figures out what's happening, I'll be gone and she'll be left holding the bag." But Nadine's most devastating revelation came near the end of her testimony. 3 weeks before his arrest, Andrew told me he was planning to leave me too. He had another woman in Costa Rica, someone he'd met online. He was going to abandon me just like he abandoned his wife. The look on Andrew's face was worth every moment of pain he'd caused me. His jaw dropped, his attorney frantically whispered in his ear, but the damage was done. His mistress had just revealed that he'd been playing everyone, including her. The next day brought another shock. A young man named Christopher Walsh took the stand. 22 years old, with Andrew's same sharp jawline and calculating eyes. The prosecutor established his identity quickly. Andrew's son from a college relationship, whose existence Andrew had hidden for over 2 decades. My mother has been receiving payments from Andrew Mitchell for 22 years, Christopher testified. $1,500 a month to keep quiet about my existence. She has records showing the money came from his client accounts. I watched Andrew shrink in his chair as Christopher continued. He told my mother that if she ever contacted his family or went public, he'd destroy her reputation and ensure she never worked in finance again. She has that threat in writing. The prosecutor introduced 22 years of bank records, showing regular payments from the same accounts Andrew had been pillaging. He'd been stealing from elderly clients not just for luxury and escape, but to hide the evidence of his past. Andrew's defense attorney tried to object, arguing this was prejudicial and irrelevant to the financial crimes, but Judge Coleman overruled him. It establishes a pattern of deception and financial malfeasance spanning the defendant's entire adult life. On the final day of testimony, Andrew made the catastrophic decision to take the stand himself. Against his attorney's visible protests, he stood and walked to the witness box, still believing he could talk his way out of this. For 2 hours he tried to spin a narrative where he was the victim. He claimed I'd known about the affairs and approved. He insisted the elderly clients had authorized every transaction. He portrayed himself as a brilliant financial mind who'd simply made some bookkeeping errors. Then the prosecutor began his cross-examination, and Andrew's composure cracked like ice under pressure. When confronted with the recordings, he claimed they were taken out of context. When shown the forged documents, he suggested I might have created them. When presented with evidence of the hush money to Christopher's mother, he actually said, "That was a personal matter unrelated to my business." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, I held Marcus's hand on one side and Rebecca's on the other. On count 1 wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2 wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. By the time they reached count 15, Andrew had put his head in his hands. Guilty on all charges. The man who'd left me in the rain 37 miles from home was about to learn what real abandonment felt like. 2 weeks later we returned for sentencing. Judge Coleman, the same woman who'd overseen our emergency hearing months ago, looked down at Andrew with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Mitchell, you targeted the most vulnerable members of society. You betrayed the trust of clients, colleagues, and family. You showed no remorse, accepting no responsibility even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of your crimes. This court sentences you to 96 months in federal prison without the possibility of early release. 8 years. Andrew would spend 8 years behind bars. As the bailiffs prepared to lead him away, he turned to me one last time. "This isn't over," he mouthed. I stood and spoke clearly, knowing the courtroom microphones would capture every word. "You're right. The civil suits start next month." The bailiffs led Andrew away in shackles, and I walked out of the courthouse into a September afternoon that felt like the first day of spring. The civil suits would indeed start next month, with 17 of Andrew's victims seeking restitution, but that was Rebecca's battlefield now. I had something more important to build. The whistleblower reward came through 6 weeks after Andrew's sentencing, $1.2 million for providing information that led to the recovery of stolen funds. Combined with the assets the court awarded me and the trust fund my father had protected, I suddenly had the resources to do something meaningful with the pain Andrew had caused. Marcus found the building first, a renovated Victorian in Minneapolis's Whittier neighborhood that had previously housed a law firm. 3 stories, 8 offices, a conference room large enough for group sessions, and most importantly, multiple exits. Something women escaping dangerous situations would need. We signed the lease on a Thursday. By Monday, the Phoenix Foundation had its home. "We need proper security systems," Marcus said, walking through the empty rooms with his tablet making notes. "Panic buttons in every office, secured entry, surveillance that actually protects people instead of monitoring them." Valentina arrived with boxes of filing systems and encryption software. "I've already had 3 forensic accountants reach out wanting to volunteer their services. Word's spreading in the financial community about what we're doing." Rebecca had taken a leave of absence from her practice to help establish our legal aid program. "We need to be careful about how we structure this," she said, spreading incorporation documents across the conference table. "We're going to be dealing with dangerous situations, angry spouses, potential legal retaliation. Everything has to be bulletproof." Within a month, we had our first client. Maria, a teacher whose husband had hidden their savings and threatened to report her to immigration services if she tried to leave, even though she was a citizen. Valentina found the money. Rebecca filed the papers. Marcus arranged safe transportation. I sat with Maria while she cried, remembering my own tears in that hotel room the night Andrew abandoned me. Jennifer arrived at the foundation on a rainy Tuesday, 3 months sober and carrying a box of donuts as a peace offering. "I want to help," she said simply. "I know what it's like to be manipulated, to be so desperate you betray people you love. Maybe I can help others see the signs before it's too late." We started her as a volunteer, answering phones and filing paperwork. But Jennifer had a gift for talking to women who called in crisis. She understood desperation and shame in ways that even trained counselors sometimes missed. Within 6 months, she was running our support groups, sharing her story of how Andrew had exploited her addiction to gather information, helping others recognize when they were being used. My mother came to visit on one of her clear days, Marcus driving her carefully through the city she'd once known so well. She sat in my office, looking at the framed photos on the walls. Women who'd given permission to share their success stories, faces beaming as they stood in front of new apartments, at graduation ceremonies, with children they'd managed to keep safe. "Your father would be so proud," she said, touching a photo of a woman who'd escaped with 3 children and was now in nursing school. "He always said the best revenge against cruelty was kindness to others." She pulled out an envelope from her purse. "This came to the house. I thought you should see it." Inside was a newspaper clipping from the prison newsletter. Andrew had been elected treasurer of the Inmates Investment Club. Even behind bars, he was trying to maintain his image as a financial genius. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The surprise volunteer came 7 months after the trial. Nadine Rodriguez stood in our reception area, looking nothing like the woman who'd worn my grandmother's pearls. She'd cut her hair short, traded designer clothes for simple slacks and a button-down shirt, and carried herself with a humility I'd never seen before. "I've been in therapy," she said, sitting across from me in my office. "Working through how I got involved with someone like Andrew, why I ignored the red flags, why I participated in hurting you. I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can prevent other young women from making my mistakes." She started by speaking at colleges, warning business students about older men in power who promise career advancement in exchange for companionship. She was brutally honest about her own choices, taking responsibility while also explaining the gradual manipulation that made those choices seem reasonable at the time. "He made me feel special," she told a group of graduate students one evening. "Like I was smarter and more sophisticated than other women my age. By the time I realized I was just another victim in his game, I was in too deep to see the exit." 1 year after Andrew's sentencing, a letter arrived at the foundation. His handwriting was still perfect, even on prison stationery. 4 pages of vitriol, blaming me for his downfall, claiming I'd orchestrated everything from the beginning, that I'd entrapped him. He listed every perceived slight, every moment he now realized had been part of my plan. The final line read, "I hope you learned your lesson." I had the letter professionally framed and hung it on my office wall, right next to my degrees and certifications. When clients asked about it, I told them the truth. Yes, I had learned my lesson. I'd learned that when someone shows you who they are through their cruelty, believe them. I'd learned that patience and planning could overcome years of abuse. Most importantly, I'd learned that the best response to someone trying to break you is to become unbreakable, then use that strength to lift others. 18 months after that night at the rest stop, I stood in my office looking at a wall covered in thank you cards. 87 women had found safety through the Phoenix Foundation. Some had needed just legal advice and financial forensics. Others had required complete extraction plans, safe houses, and new identities. Each one had arrived broken in some way, convinced they were trapped, that their situation was hopeless. Eleanor Hartley, the widow Andrew had defrauded, had become our biggest donor. She'd recovered most of her money through the civil suits and insisted on funding our emergency shelter program. That man tried to convince me I was losing my mind, she said at our fundraising gala. Amanda showed me I was actually finding my strength. The rain was falling again outside, drumming against the windows of the Victorian that housed hopes and second chances. I thought about that night 37 miles from home, standing in the downpour while Andrew drove away, confident he'd broken me. He thought he was teaching me about power and control, about knowing my place. Instead, he taught me that cruelty creates its own destruction, that every action has consequences, and that sometimes the person you abandon in the rain has already seen the storm coming and prepared accordingly. Through the Phoenix Foundation, his act of calculated cruelty had become the catalyst for saving women he never believed deserved saving. The ultimate lesson, the one Andrew never saw coming, wasn't about obedience or respect or knowing one's place. It was about transformation. He tried to leave me powerless in a storm. Instead, I'd become the shelter. If this story of calculated justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Amanda stood in court, wearing the sharp suit Andrew always said made women look too aggressive, and smiled at him with the same serene expression she used to give him over breakfast. What was your favorite moment of sweet revenge? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more gripping stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.